episode 1 of Speakeasy Podcasts, Policy in Pop Culture. In today's episode, we'll unpack how movies and media reflect real-world governance, inequality, and public policy. Today, we look at a deceptively simple story, a young girl who wants a bicycle. We are discussing Wadjda, the 2012 Saudi film directed by Haifa Al-Mansour, the first feature film shot entirely in Saudi Arabia and the first by a Saudi female director. On the surface, it follows a 10-year-old determined girl to buy a green bicycle so she can race her friend. But beneath that simplicity lie deeper questions. When does a social norm become a structural barrier? When does something informal start shaping real economic outcomes? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Francis-Tan, Assistant Dean and Senior Lecturer at the LKYSPP School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Andy is a quantitative economist whose research focuses on education, labor, demography, and the policies that shape inequality and social identity, including race, gender, and religion. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I want to thank you ahead of time, Lariba and Pradeep, for organizing this podcast.
Thank you, Andy, for your kind words. For anyone who has not watched Wadjda, here's a quick version. Wadjda is a smart, resourceful, and a little rebellious girl. She wants to buy a bicycle she sees in a shop window. To earn the money, she enters a Quran recitation competition at school. At the same time, her mother is dealing with the possibility that her husband may take a second wife because she has not given birth to a son. The film is gentle. There are no big speeches. But everything feels controlled. The school, the household, and even the public spaces. Andy, when you watch this, what jumps out at you? Not emotionally, but structurally. What systems are operating underneath this very simple story?
Well, first of all, I really, really love this movie. And for all you listeners out there, you should check out this movie. It's powerful, it's simple, and I'll try to give you my kind of introduction to it. I see this movie as a coming-of-age story. It's about a girl, 10 years old, who's learning about how to become a woman in a world where there are many constraints on women. The movie is really the perspective of her and her mother. The movie throughout takes a female perspective. And what's, I think, quite fascinating about the movie is that men are both ever present and absent. For much of the movie, we don't see many men. There's the male gaze. There's occasionally men in the background. Wadjda's father comes in and out of the household. But for by and large, it's mostly mostly a movie focused on women. But the presence of men at the same time is very heavy. They're the ones that are controlling what women can and cannot do, giving permission to them to leave the house or not. Men are the ones giving rides to, for example, Wadjda's mother, who isn't allowed to drive. Men are ever present in that sense, but also absent.
Andy, when you talk about the omnipresent male gaze in the movie, it brings me to my first question, that is about mobility and inequality. Economists talk a lot about mobility, social mobility, economic mobility, intergenerational mobility. And in this film, mobility is literal. It's a bicycle, which is being constrained and confined by this omnipresent male gaze that is everywhere but is nowhere at the same time. But symbolically, what does restricting physical mobility do to long-term human capital formation? If girls internalize limits early on space, ambition, or public presence, how might that affect educational outcomes or, in future, the labor force participation in life? And as a parent, you are a parent to a girl as well. How are you trying to not draw those lines, even unintentionally as well?
Oh, that's a lot of questions, Lariba. Let me start with your first one. Your first one is about how growing up in a society like this would stifle women's growth and participation in the labor market and educational attainment. And it certainly does. There's evidence, as a social scientist, I can tell you there's evidence across many countries that these constraints make it harder for women to progress in school, to graduate on time, even to go to college, and to participate in the labor market fully. you see all of these things in the movie. So Wadjda and her mother have lots of ambition and a lot of aspiration, both for education and for the labor market. But you also see how they're blocked at various turns in the movie. The movie's central motif is worth mentioning here, and really it's the bicycle. The bicycle symbolizes the freedom, in this case, freedom of movement that Wadjda craves. That same desire for freedom is what many of the women in the movie also are striving for. I won't spoil the movie, but it does end happy in that she at least gets access to the bike. She gets the bike that she covets for most of the movie, symbolizing that this freedom can be attainable for some people. But there's other motifs in the movie too. I mean, we see other kinds of objects, also objects related to mobility that crop up. Things like Wadjda's shoes, as well as the car that takes her mother to her job, which is very far away. So in every case, we see that these inventions, these innovations, the shoe we take for granted is an innovation, and it does allow more mobility out there in the world. And that's true for the women in the movie too. But you see in the movie that there are constraints even on the color of the shoes, the style of the shoes. There's constraints that we see being imposed at school, at Wadjda's school. The same thing's true for cars. Women are not allowed to drive at this time in Saudi Arabia. Later, a few years ago, they were allowed to drive. I don't know what year actually. And so you see that there's constraints on how the mother can use cars, and she's utterly dependent on a man that she pays to drive her long, long distances. So there's really an irony there in the movie that she's this talented woman who works in a school, but she's very much dependent on this uneducated man to drive her. And of course, the central motif of the bike, that many people told Wadjda that she shouldn't ride a bike. She's a girl. She shouldn't buy this thing. And she just covets the bike throughout the movie and uses her wit to gather money to attempt to buy it.
Andy, I noticed that you did not answer the final question I had for you. As a parent, what would you do to approach this internalization of limits early on space, on ambition, public presence, on perceiving the other gender, what the other gender, has their perspectives on, etc., etc.?
As a parent.
As a parent.
Okay, personally, I think I didn't answer the question because it's a hard question. And I can contrast what I've learned about my kids with what I see depicted in the movie. So the kids in the movie, Wadjda especially, is experiencing things for the first time. She's thinking about these really deep themes about women's role, social norms, and such. My kids do wrestle with these themes, but the number of influences is much bigger. So they get influences from other people, from school, from friends, from social media, from legacy media, all over. They're hearing different advice and stories. They're seeing different kinds of behaviors being modeled. I think it's actually a lot more confusing for real kids than Wadjda, who really thinks quite clearly about her situation and cleverly attempts to find a way out. So, I mean, as a parent, I can see it's complex for the kids, and it's hard for parents to influence them too, knowing that there's many other influences. And I think it's challenging in practice. So that's why this is a hard question to answer.
And when it comes to children, enforcement is not an option. It's more about sensitizing them into a thinking or into a way of living where they respect the other gender, they respect the mobility of the other gender, and are supportive of each other in general.
Yeah, what parents can do above all is to model these rules, model these values with your spouse.
Yeah.
A lot of times parents say that their kids don't listen to them, but they're always watching. They're always noticing, even if they don't recognize explicitly that they've learned a lesson, quote unquote. They are seeing what you're doing as a husband and wife. So I think the minimal that you can do, but the most important thing you can do is just model appropriate behavior with your spouse.
Children.
I think that would that's the
makes a
simplest
difference,
thing to
yeah.
do that makes a big difference.
Correct.
To be more heavy-handed is pretty hard, I would say.
Yes. Also, coming to your point where you mention about the schools having these limits for the children, despite being a space of growth and of ambition and of realizing dreams. And in the movie itself, school does symbolize mobility for Wadjda, but the school in the movie is very fascinating. It's an educational institution, but it also enforces a lot of gender expectations, from dress codes to behavioral norms. And according to you, like from your research, how can schools sometimes reproduce these inequalities rather than reduce it? And can institutions designed for meritocracy still reinforce stratification?
Definitely, schools reproduce social inequality in society. They're microcosms of society. The biases, the assumptions, the stereotypes that teachers have in their lives, they bring that to school as well. That plays out in classrooms, whether it's discrimination or favoritism happening between genders or ethnic groups or religions. That's one aspect of it, is teachers bring it into the classroom. Oftentimes, policymakers see schools as like a sacred space where anything is possible, our possibilities are unleashed, empowerment can happen. But the reality is quite nuanced. It's that schools give knowledge, give inspiration, and certainly help in many ways, but they also reproduce a lot of inequalities. You can see that in the movie too. The movie depicts learning, it's true, but at the same time, the learning that's occurring is happening in an environment that's also teaching women their roles. Their subservient secondary roles in society. And it's really inseparable. The learning of knowledge and the cognitive lessons are inseparable from the lessons about norms and behavior. There's a character in the movie that is actually quite important. It's the head mistress, and she plays a big role. And it's interesting because she has this. I think she sees Wadjda in the movie and says, "You know, you remind me of me when I was your age," and that's a really, really telling observation, because it tells you that these kinds of behaviors and norms are learned. So she sees Wadjda as someone who's wild and free, but needs to be tamed and reined in.
Yeah.
And she recognized that she also went through that process. Now she's endorsing this process. She's saying that this is what it should be. Indeed, her role as like head teacher is to do this with the students in the school. But you can see that it's a transformation that happens as girls become women. And it's something that happens at school for the most part. I think more scenes happen at school than happen at home in this movie.
But I feel like that the norms and the entire processes that are being mandated over the kids in school, and when the kids encounter a very similar thinking back at home, so I think the twofold enforcement really nullifies what they are actually learning in terms of their subjects, their education, knowledge, growth, everything. I think the twofold impact of imposition of norms, of cultures, of roles, of even as something as basic as dress codes really nullifies what we're trying to teach them beyond just being a student at a particular institution. And I think then when you are moving towards the end of your educational years at a college, at a school or anything, you are literally left with two options: either be the correct way of being a woman in the society or be the rebel. And then there would be, at some point or the other, you will always find a headmistress in your jobs, in your institutions, in anywhere you are in the world, who would try to tame you. And it really makes you take this moral choice whether you want to be a rebel or you want to be
it's like
a
the enforcers are everywhere.
Yeah,
and we should say that the enforcers aren't just men. Actually, in this movie, it's mostly women.
Yeah, they're the gatekeepers of
They're the
entire,
gatekeepers of this whole system.
Yes.
And you're right. It forces a choice for some women. Do I conform or do I rebel?
Yeah.
And in this movie, Wadjda is certainly portrayed as the rebellious one for most of the movie. But I think we realize during the movie that she's not exceptional, I would say. That there's other girls out there that are thinking the same things, going through the same struggles. We also find out that her mother also has a lot of the same struggles. At the beginning of the movie, the mother is a conformist.
Yes.
She's kind of going with the system. She complains about certain aspects of the system, but she goes with it. She conforms. But toward the end of the movie, we realize she has some really deep struggles herself, and must come with some difficult decisions as she's faced with the possibility that her husband takes another wife. So we see that this struggle that Wadjda has is a struggle that all the women in this movie seem to have, forcing them to become the rebel.
Yeah. Agreed, Andy. I mean, and this brings me to the next question that I had, that how early do these identities become economically consequential? And what I observed in the movie about Wajda's mother is that maybe she was also a Wajda when she was 12-year old. She had her dreams. She then entered a school which reinforced these norms, these expectations, these cultures, and then she ultimately became a conformist. And that it was economically consequential for her as well. She did not have a say in her own marriage. She was always loomed upon by this fear that some other woman might enter her house, might marry her husband because she might be able to give her a son. And then again, son is being correlated to, again, making money and being economically more well off in the society. So for me, it's like a loop. It's a vicious circle which reinforces identities, doesn't let you come out of the given identities, and then it just goes back around.
I completely agree with you, Lariba. I think you can see this play out in the marriages that happen in the movie. You already discussed the marriage of Wajda's mother and how she was tied financially to her husband and constrained in that way. But we also see a child marriage in this movie. We don't actually see the ceremony, but the girl announces that she's getting married in class. And at first the girls are excited. They look at the picture of the husband, I think, and they talk about it a bit. But you can see that it immediately disrupts her learning and her trajectory after that. Kind of symbolically in the Quran competition, I think that's a girl that messes up and doesn't win. And I think the movie is trying to draw our attention to the fact that she didn't have enough focus and time to study. And already she's paying the consequence for the early marriage, the child marriage. Marriage itself is a big theme because you're right, it does relate to women's independence, economic independence, as well as emotional and social independence. The women in the movie are highly dependent on the men, and that link is through marriage for sure. At the end of the movie, of course, I guess I give away too much, but Wajda's father does take a second wife, and that puts her mother in a very difficult, precarious position. And the climax of the movie is when Wajda's mom basically chooses her over her husband. in a sense, in a symbolic and material sense.
I mean, and Wajda's mother's character is like, her storyline feels very important. Again, for me, she's also a Wajda who just happened to conform to the society. Her vulnerability is tied to, again, economic dependency. But from a policy perspective, Andy, how much do you think the economic participation actually can shift power inside households? And beyond economic participation, beyond your financial independence as well, are there any other ways as well for changing dynamics for a woman in the society and while being in a marriage as well? Do like the legal and the cultural frameworks also need to move at the same time? Does it, or is there a need for government to intervene here and
usually there is a need for government to intervene. So I mean, a lot of the literature in economic development and women's empowerment does focus on financial independence. That is labor market participation and control over earnings. And there's a lot of evidence that when women do get control over earnings and are able to work in the market, it helps them in many ways. Actually, it helps them and their family in terms of health, education of kids, and so forth. But does anything else have to change? I mean, if it's only that change, you can see that it's not sufficient. This movie does feature a woman that works, but she's also highly constrained. So obviously, getting a job is not enough. The way I see it is that it seems like the men are realizing that when women get a job, they're very close to independence and autonomy. And that's when the rules clamp down the hardest. It seems to me that the rules are the most severe because the financial independence is so powerful. So yes, society and policy should shift to make it easier to inherit, to make it easier to divorce if you're stuck in a bad marriage. There's a lot of legal shifts that also need to happen, so that complement the change in economic independence of women. So I do agree. It's yes and yes. Government does need to act, because social norms don't necessarily change overnight, and it takes time for the social norms to change. It usually does take the government to signal that there's a new direction that we need to go in. I'm pretty sure the Saudi government now is trying to signal that they're going in a new direction for women. They have made a lot of reforms along those lines. So you can see the government trying to signal, both symbolically and materially, that there's a new direction.
Yeah.
But change does take time.
Change does take time.
Even in developed societies, there are gender inequalities.
Agreed. And I feel like when these informal norms, they exist for too long, they risk becoming a policy on their own as well without any government intervention. And like one of the most interesting elements in the movie is that there is no dramatic, like, courtroom drama or any, legal ban on bicycles. There's no law about it that a girl can't own a bicycle. But it's a social norm which ultimately is being observed by everybody like a law that no, if you're trying to own a bicycle, it is as bad as violating a law by the government, which is kind of a bit disheartening to see as well.
Yeah, shows you how powerful social norms are. They're basically they're de facto laws.
Yeah, exactly.
To many people.
And I mean, governments can they like legislate equality effectively if social norms lag behind? What does the research say about how quickly gender norms shift after there is some kind of intervention or reforms?
I think the truth is it's very complicated. So when the government acts first, usually there are positives that women can be uplifted in certain ways, their families as well. But there's a lot of evidence that if men are not on board, sometimes the reforms can backfire, to the extent that there could be an empowerment program that benefits women, but the husband of the family actually controls the purse. He's the one that actually takes the money that she makes and controls it. So it's very difficult to legislate what happens at home. A lot of policies can signal, new norms, but unless the participants, the adults at home, really believe these norms and embrace them, real change may not happen. So I think it's frustrating. And I think you also see, this is an interesting time now because I think in a lot of societies, men seem to be, quote, fighting back, pushing back against empowerment and trying to establish or reestablish kind of traditional values, especially in developed countries, most surprisingly in developed countries, also in developing countries. So I think you're seeing interesting complex dynamics where in some cases you do see women's progress, but in the societies, you also see some backlash from men that don't want society to look like this. So I'm not sure where we're headed, but I think we're not at the equilibrium yet.
I mean, it's interesting when you mention that men are backlashing primarily in the developed nations, which brings me to my next question that is about Singapore. That, I mean, there is no open backlash or anything.
Nothing major is happening here with respect to gender. Subtle things are happening.
Yes. And I mean, Singapore often ranks very high in education and female workforce participation, but I believe that no society is immune to structural inequality, and there have been steps, there have been like strategic thinking behind making Singapore what it is right now. So according to you, where should policymakers in developed states be paying closer attention when it comes to subtle or embedded gender disparities? Are there any lessons from Singapore or global research on inequality that are universally applicable?
Singapore is a really interesting case because it's a small country that really needs everyone to work. There's a strong incentive for the government to get women into the labor market. So many women work in Singapore. It's very common to have a two-earner household. And a lot of policies help support that. There's a very strong tax policy that you might not be aware of that gives a huge tax break for working women that have kids. There's also policies to encourage families to have more kids. So actually, women's labor force participation is very high here, and the difference between men and women is small. The earnings gap is also fairly small compared to a lot of places. But where I think you see the, quote, subtle inequalities happens through women's double burden. So women are expected to work here, but they're also expected to take care of kids more than the men. So that makes it hard. Work hours are high here. It's not easy to work in Singapore, man or woman. And so if you're a woman working, you have to put in all those hours. You're probably paid fairly well. The standard of living is pretty high here, but yet after work you have a lot of responsibilities. And there are pressures on families to get kids up to par when it comes to learning, and there's independent pressures on kids for educational outcomes. And so women are often a part of that. They're the ones helping the kids learn, helping with homework, spending time with them. And it seems to disproportionately fall on them. So I think, the way you see it subtly in Singapore is just this double burden. You don't see it as much in the labor market. It's not as stark. The Saudi Arabia case is very extreme and very different hard to compare it to Singapore. But these kinds of inequalities exist in lots of societies, including Singapore. Although you're right, it is more subtle.
I mean, it's subtle, and I mean the external factors which also pushes the female workforce participation higher in Singapore would be, again, safety as well, because from the place that I come from, I think I would not be very much comfortable in working late hours or extending my work hours because I'll have to return late at night, and it's not very safe. So I think these kind of subtle differences that I have faced as a woman here actually makes a lot of difference. I would rather enjoy working longer here than anywhere else in the world. So these kind of enabling factors are also there, but then you mentioned the informal reasons which might also bog down women from actually joining the workforce is that they are burdened, they have double pressures, and then educational burden on the kids is a different topic altogether. I can go hours and hours talking about it.
So you can see in a situation like Singapore where actually life is very good for women. You can see if the tougher, challenging parts of life relate to balancing work and home life, more women are going to choose to have fewer kids, or even no kids, or not get married. And that's the government's current dilemma, because not enough people are getting married, not enough people are having enough kids. So demographically, they worry about this. But it's a function of women's choices coming from the inequality in the home.
So it's like a lot of reasons and solutions coming together to create this dilemma, I think.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue. So the government wants more marriages to happen, but it has to change other things so that people will choose these marriages.
Absolutely, Andy. The bicycle in Wadjda is modest. It's not a revolution. But perhaps policy change often isn't either. It's incremental, negotiated, and subtle. If there's one thing this film teaches us, it's that inequality doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a child being told something is not appropriate. It shows us that mobility is not just physical, it's structural. Institutions shape identity, small constraints accumulate into large outcomes. And this brings me to the final question, Andy. If you were advising a government concerned about gender inequality today, what would be your top policy priority? And for our listeners, what's this one question they should ask when they consume media about inequality?
I guess I would say, since we're on the topic of family and children, I think I'm a strong believer that when a couple has a child, that there should be a long maternity and paternity leave that's taken. Too often, men don't take their paternity leave. Not all men in Singapore take it up. Even if they do take it up, it's just a small number of weeks. I think society would be much better if paternity leave was longer, and they helped out at home. There's lots of things to do when you have a small child. It's part of the reason why people don't want to have kids. It's just a lot of hard work. And so there's a lot to do. And so men would have lots of things to help out with. So there's not like there's a dearth of things to do when there's a small child. There's a lot of things they can help out with. And if they also help out and spend the time, probably that will create better bonds with their own child. They'll spend more time with that child when the child is older. And I think things will be more even in terms of childcare responsibilities and the burden at home. So I think in the Singapore context, that's certainly what I would go for. In the context of Saudi Arabia, it's hard to say. Going back to the movie does offer hope. The movie ends very optimistically.
Yeah.
And there's one character that I see as kind of symbolizing a bright future. And that's actually the boy in the movie. His name is Abdallah.
Yeah.
He's Wadjda's friend throughout. And toward the end, he even tells her that he wants to marry her. He's also 10 years old. So I don't know if that's typical of a 10-year-old to say something like that to their friends. But he really symbolizes a better future and a better man.
Yeah.
I just don't know how to create more Abdallahs. The movie doesn't give a sense of how that happens, except assuming that generational change brings it. But and it also, I think, comes from the innocence of childhood.
Yeah.
Like when people are born and they're children, they don't necessarily understand everything about all the complexities of the adult world, including the bad stuff.
Yeah.
So Abdallah is kind of innocent of these patriarchal elements, as is Wadjda. She is beginning to become more aware of them, but she's not. They haven't changed her so much at this point. So the innocence of childhood allows Abdallah to be as perfect as he is. I just want to know what is it gonna be like when he grows up. He also has to navigate these same norms as Wadjda, and will he be affected? And if he conforms, the future won't be as bright as the movie depicts.
I mean, well said. I think I had a very similar dilemma about having more Abdallahs. Will this Abdallah survive the kind of pressure that the society subjects a child to before they turn into an adult and then end up conforming to what the society wants you to conform to? So movie for me also ended with a hope, of course, but also a certain sort of pessimism that ultimately, if we don't take actions, if we don't intervene, we might end up losing more Abdallahs to the conditioning that we all have grown up in some way or the other. But I think with this hope of finding some ways to create more Abdallahs, create more of an inclusive society, I would come to an end to this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to explore similar films that examine inequality, identity, and governance through intimate storytelling, here are a few recommendations. First, The Breadwinner. It's a story of a young girl surviving under Taliban rule by disguising herself as a boy. Then comes Roma, a deeply human portrayal of class, domestic labor, and structural inequality. And the third one, which is named Hidden Figures, it's a look at institutional barriers shaped by race and gender. Thank you again, Professor Andy. It was amazing having you here. It was a very thoughtful conversation. I enjoyed speaking to you a lot.
Thank you for inviting me.
And to everyone listening, the next time you watch a film, ask yourself, what systems are quietly at work here? Because policy is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like a bicycle. Thank you for listening to Speakeasy Podcast. Thank you to Pradeep for making this possible. And thank you to the Speakeasy Club for giving me this platform to actually come up with an idea and realize it while I'm here. And until next time, watch closely and question deeply.